Have you ever wondered how a tennis shoe could become an icon in both sports and fashion? Well, this time we're going to dive into the story of the Nike AirTech Challenge 2, which is a sneaker that has definitely left its mark both on the court and on the streets. This time on Fire Footwear. Welcome back to Fire Footwear, everybody. As always, this is your host, Matt Frates. I hope that this finds you well, and I, as always, want to thank you for tuning into this podcast and spending time with me every single week. If you are new, and we have had somewhat of an influx of new people, I want to welcome you, and I want to also say thank you for basically giving me any semblance of your time. I want to give a shout out to Greg and George, too, from the Sneak Disc podcast, because they had me on as a guest this week. It was a really great experience to go on and talk shop with somebody else in the sneaker community. And we talked about shoes that had a story. And at the end of the episode, it was very long. We talked for almost 3 hours, which is pretty unusual for me. We did a top 10 list of stories with sneakers, or best sneakers with stories to us. And when we were giving the list, I gave my list and I was pretty happy with it. But during that time, Greg gave one of his shoes, and it was the AirTech Challenge 2. And it got me to thinking about what I wanted to talk about this week. And one of the things that I had thought I wanted to talk about was a continuation of the series that we had done. But as I thought about it, I realized that between people and just shoe models, that's really what fundamentally has changed the game over time. And so I think we need to move on from that series and take deeper dives into some of these shoes and maybe even some of these people and even deeper into some of these colorways. And we're going to do that. And I think we're going to do that by starting with the AirTech Challenge 2, because the AirTech Challenge 2 is a shoe that we now know is going to get a retro of this year. And that retro is going to be probably considered in the reimagined phase of Nike right now, but it's going to have what looks like an aged outsole. The shape is a little bit different. It looks like the toe box isn't as pointed as the 2019 iteration, but we're going to get that shoe. And that shoe is a classic, not just to me, but to many people. And so for Greg to give it as part of his list and talk about the story, I thought it was very important to take what we talked about then and translate it to this podcast. Because as I said on that show, I a lot of times will listen to other sneaker podcasters and I will take what they say, think about it, form an opinion, and then bring it to you as a topic that we can either build on or maybe even educate you on. And so let's start and dive into what was the AirTech Challenge 2. The AirTech Challenge 2 was designed by none other than Tinker Hatfield. And this is the same guy that created the Air Jordan 3, the same guy that created the Air Max 1, and he's done so many other iconic shoes at Nike and with Jordan Brand. Tinker Hatfield's resume speaks for itself. So the fact that the AirTech Challenge 2 is also on that resume is actually pretty incredible. And just the fact that he designed it, I think, gives a little bit of credibility to the shoe in general. I know that he has had some failures in terms of design, but I think for the most part, most things that Tinker Hatfield has designed or touched have actually been very, very good. Now, this shoe is very dated if you look at it today, and the shoe is almost 40 years old now. But if you look at the materials, the upper featured a blend of leather and synthetic materials, which isn't too dissimilar from what we see today. And that had an offering of durability, and it also offered support. And I think that the combination of these two things, when you talk about creating a tennis shoe, it allowed at the time for the rigors of intense tennis play. And I think when you think about what it meant at the time to have a tennis shoe of this kind, it was pretty remarkable. It had perforated panels for breathability. It had polyurethane with a visible air sole unit, which was something that Tinker Hatfield had already done with the Air Max 1. And so that wasn't something that was new now. It was something that became commonplace. And the outsole, of course, was rubber. It had a herringbone pattern. Herringbone is one of my favorite patterns. I think it stands the test of time. And a lot of people will recognize this outsole, and we'll talk about that later. And then if you get to the history of it, it released in 1989. And if you think about the world in 1989, you think about sports in 1989, and also think about the sneaker community in 1989, this was really a time where Jordan was on the ascension. He hadn't yet won a title, but he was starting to create moments. the free throw line dunk at the All-Star game, the Craig Elo shot in the Air Jordan 4 black and red. And now you have tennis, which was gaining tremendous popularity at the time. And I think that this shoe really tied into where tennis became part of popular culture in a very, very big way. And why is that? That's because the shoe was tied to none other than Andre Agassi. Andre Agassi is a name that I wonder if you are of a certain age, you actually don't know who he is. If not for this shoe, would you know who Andre Agassi is? Tennis historically has been the kind of sport, much like golf, that has been seen as stuffy, that has been seen as almost country club-esque, very exclusive. And I think that tennis started to become a little bit different with Andre Agassi because yes, you had John McEnroe prior to, but Andre Agassi represented something a little bit different. John McEnroe, I think his attitude and the way that he conducted himself on the court was a little counterculture, not just a little, it was very counterculture. I think it was counterculture to tennis specifically, but Andre Agassi and his look with the long hair, the bright colors, a lot of it really transcended tennis and was really pop culture. So now you give him this shoe and it sort of takes off. And we've had a lot of re-releases, a lot of retros over the years, but because it was attached to him, and Greg even talked about the fact that there were clothing that went with it. And those clothes very much matched the aesthetic that was on the very first colorway of the Air Tech Challenge 2. And since that time, obviously Andre Agassi has retired and the tennis is a lot different now. I think that shoe within sneaker culture in some places has sort of gotten a cult following. And maybe that's not accurate because if you think about a cult following, it would have to be something that would have been bad in the first place. And I know for me, subjectively, that shoe was not bad in the first place. And I don't think that it was received in a bad way at the time. But over the course of time, something like this that is so old and also isn't in line with like your signature Jordan line, I can see how people would say that it has sort of developed a cult following. And honestly, I think that people now are a little bit more aware of the shoe in general, maybe not the history. There were really three notable colorways if you think about it. There was the Wimbledon, of course. Now, Wimbledon is grass courts. Obviously, it is one of the oldest, if not the oldest tennis tournament in the world. I would dare say that it's probably the most prestigious. That was one of the colorways. Of course, there was a colorway that was inspired by Roland Garros. That was the French Open. And of course, Roland Garros has clay courts, and so you had some inspiration there. But I think that the colorway that really stood the test of time and the one that they are actually retroing in a reimagined way is the Hot Lava colorway. We're talking about a white base, it had black, a little bit of orange, and it was the bright pink. This was really the most famous and iconic version because it was so striking. The combination of all of these colors not just stood out in terms of sneakers, but they stood out on the court. And they really exemplified the kind of style that the 80s was all about. And even though they came out late in the 80s, very late in the 80s, I think they still kind of kept that aesthetic and they brought that same aesthetic into the 90s. And if you think back to the 90s, we are so used to, I think, thinking of the 90s about bright colors, even though in the house we had a lot of floral patterns and things like that. I think this really started that. And so you had all of this taking place. And of course, you had the technological innovations with continuing to use the visible air unit. And of course, you had just the idea of like more of a high top tennis sneaker. It had durability, it had support. And now what it was also getting was a cultural influence and even a fashion influence because Andre Agassi was very popular back then. And I don't think you can really overstate just how popular he was. And by extension, this shoe and all of the things that came with it became not just popular on court, but off court as well. There was so much charisma that Andre Agassi brought to the sport. And yes, a lot of traditionalists probably thought to themselves, this guy is ruining the sport. Really what he was doing was bringing a needed character to the sport. And I think that players today are less willing to be buttoned up. There are a lot of players who are willing to show their emotions on the court, wear their emotions on their sleeve. I think that all started back here. And I think now when you talk about tennis, a lot of companies are willing to take more risks when it comes to the design of tennis products and even tennis shoes. Tennis shoes in reality are what many people of a certain age think of just all sneakers. And that's because shoes for a long, long time really up until the Air Jordan, for the most part, were seen as white and safe. And I don't mean that in skin tone. I mean that in the way that the shoes looked. They were white. They were safe. And now you're talking about tennis shoes being associated with bright colors, vibrance, character, all of these different traits that we never really associated with tennis. And now over the years, we've had collaborations, and the Air Tech Challenge 2 has been part of streetwear collaborations, so many different things. And I think when you look back on it, you have to consider this shoe in the pantheon of some of the greatest shoes ever made. I think that you have to consider this shoe as part of your collection if it isn't already. And if you are somebody who doesn't know who Andre Agassi is, who doesn't know why the Air Tech Challenge is such a big deal, or why it is even worthy of the reimagined state, I think you need to go back and learn a little bit more history. What I've given you here is very general information. It's accurate information, but it's very general. And I want to also give my opinion on the reimagined state of it, because it's going around Twitter, it's going around Instagram. We've seen official pictures now. One of the cool things is we saw Andre Agassi wearing a version of the shoe, and of course he would get an early pair of them because he was really the reason why this shoe took off the way that it did. A lot of people are complaining about the way that it looks. They're trying to compare the shape to the 2019 version to more of an OG version, and I totally understand that. I think what Nike is going for here is they are trying to give us a reimagined look. And by doing so, I think the aged outsole is a dead giveaway that they're going for this shoe to look a little bit different. You all know that I feel a certain way about the reimagined series. I've liked some, I haven't liked some. The reimagined series, in my opinion, should have stories attached to these shoes, and they just don't. A lot of them are just aging, or even just taking risks on materials. So the Royal Ones, those just switch materials. The reimagined 4s, which are undeniable fire, they just switch materials. But the reimagined 3s had more of an aged look. The Jordan 1 Lost and Found, which are considered the start of the reimagined, had a very specific story attached to them. And so it's a little bit disappointing that they're just going for an aged look here. However, we don't know if they're going to try and tell a story. And if the idea of it being aged has to do with the fact that it is such an old shoe, and you are supposed to find this shoe in your collection, you've had it for this long, and it looks like this, it is pretty logical to think that the shape would be different, that you'd have some aging on the outsole. And you know what though? Even after all of that, even though it's disappointing that we don't know a story, and even though it's disappointing that maybe they are churning out these reimagines a dime a dozen, this is a fire shoe. And I think that what we know about the execution is also very fire. I would think that this shoe is actually still fire if I found it in my collection looking the way that it does in those pictures. I think that the ageness of it is actually a really cool factor for something that is so old. I don't think that you can really age something that is new, and I'm talking about a new silhouette or a new model. I don't think that makes a lot of sense. But something with 30 plus years of history, something that is undeniably part of a time period in which maybe a lot of sneakerheads weren't even alive for, I think making that look aged is actually really, really neat. What I would love to have with it though, if I'm being honest, is a good story. For Nike to really lean into the history so that many people can learn about it the way that I'm trying to teach you here. And again, I don't know everything about it. I will never know everything about it. I wish that I had an original pair. I wish that I had the opportunity to get a pair of them in some of the retros that have come out, but this is going to be my chance, and it is going to be your chance. And if you listen to that episode that I did with Greg, you know that history is important to me, and it should be important to everybody in the sneaker community. No matter how old or how young you are, the history is what got us here, and it should help define how you participate today. The new generation should have their own thing. The old generation should continue to embrace the newness of today's game, but also look back and remember the old times. All of this can be true, and I think that this shoe is a perfect representation of both old and new, and it's a great thing for sneaker culture. And before we get you out of here, let's get to Release of the Week. Release of the Week, where I like to highlight a shoe that has caught my eye. It's not always hype, Sometimes it is. It's just a shoe that I think that you should know about. And after doing releases with Greg over the weekend, I realized that there are a ton of shoes that come out every single week, and I need to continue to give you something that is a little bit off the beaten path. So this time, we are going with a Converse, but this is the Carhartt Whip Converse 1 Star. And this is not a Converse Chuck Taylor All-Star, but it's a low-top Converse. It looks very, very similar to a Converse, but it's got that Carhartt look to it with some really durable materials. It's brown, it's got some tan, it's got a white outsole. And this falls into the category of a shoe that is something that you could put on pretty much anywhere that you go, and it could really be multifaceted. And this releases on June 6th for $85, which is a great retail price. Maybe some would consider it high for a Converse shoe, but in today's day and age when people are paying $300 for the Jordan 17 Lightning, this is a steal by comparison. So if you need something that's a house shoe or something that you can just wear just about anywhere, this is your pickup right here. The AirTech Challenge 2 has a steeped history, and we have gone through it in what I consider somewhat of a deep dive, and I hope that you enjoyed it. I hope that you learned something, and I hope that it has put the shoe on the map for you. I would love to know how you feel about the pictures that we've seen of this reimagined AirTech Challenge 2. Let me know. Hit up the show on Instagram at FireFootwearPod is the handle. If you want to see some reels on TikTok at FireFootwearPod. The show is on Facebook. Fire Footwear is what you can search. And if you want to find the show on YouTube, Fire Footwear, a sneaker podcast is what you would search. It is not a rehash of these episodes. I am doing a lot different work on there. And so if you are interested, check that out and make sure to hit like, subscribe, all of that good stuff. I hope this finds everybody well, fam. I hope this finds everybody safe, as I always do. I want to thank you. Again, a shout out to Sneak This Podcast for having me on this week, and I will talk to you all next week. This is Fire Footwear. The opinions and viewpoints expressed on Fire Footwear are those of Matt Frates and his guests, and not necessarily those of the Matty Ice Media Network. Fire Footwear is exclusively owned by Matt Frates and is brought to you by the Matty Ice Media Network.